carrying with it the scent of dying leaves and distant wood smoke. Roman McKinney stood on the porch of his childhood home, his weathered hands gripping a cup of black coffee that had long since gone cold. 3 tours in Afghanistan had taught him to read the silence between sounds, and something in the air tonight felt wrong. Roman had built his life on discipline and loyalty. At 42, he was a decorated Special Forces operator with 20 years of service behind him. His body bore the scars of countless missions, a jagged line across his left shoulder from Kandahar, shrapnel marks on his forearms from Helmand Province. But the deepest wounds were invisible, carved by betrayal closer to home than any battlefield. The phone call had come 2 hours ago, pulling him from his temporary quarters at Fort Bragg, where he'd been preparing for his final deployment before retirement. "Roman? This is Sheriff Saul Barr from Millfield County." The voice had been familiar. Saul had been 3 years ahead of Roman in high school, a linebacker who'd gone into law enforcement instead of the military. They'd shared beers and war stories whenever Roman came home on leave. "Soldier, we found your son's jacket by the old reservoir. Your wife claimed he ran away." The pause that followed had stretched like a taut wire. But a hunter saw her and her boyfriend drive him out there and leave him. "It's getting cold." Roman's jaw had tightened, his free hand unconsciously forming a fist. Luke McKinney was only 14, a quiet boy with his father's dark eyes and his mother's stubborn streak. The idea of Regina, his wife of 16 years, abandoning their son in the wilderness was incomprehensible. "I'm telling the press he's a missing person," Saul had continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Her boyfriend is at the sawmill bar. You could teach him a lesson in your own style." Now, standing in the growing darkness, Roman replayed every word. Regina had been distant during his last leave 6 months ago, distracted and cold in ways that went beyond the usual strain of military marriages. She'd claimed it was stress from her job at the local insurance office, but Roman's instincts, honed by years of combat, had detected deception. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through the photos of Luke. Fishing trips to Seneca Creek, hunting expeditions in the Monongahela Forest, quiet moments reading together on this very porch. The boy was everything to Roman, the future he'd been fighting to protect, the reason he'd endured 3 deployments in a decade. Roman's phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Your boy's tough." Found him half frozen by Miller's Cave. "He's safe. S.B." Relief flooded through him, followed immediately by rage. Regina hadn't just betrayed their marriage, she'd endangered their child. The woman he'd loved since high school, the one he'd married in the little chapel on Maple Street, had crossed a line from which there could be no return. He walked back into the house, his footsteps echoing in the empty rooms. The McKinney family had owned this property for 3 generations. Roman's grandfather had built the main structure in 1952, a solid 2-story frame house with a wraparound porch and a view of the valley below. Roman's father had added the workshop and garage, teaching his son the value of working with his hands between deployments to Korea and Vietnam. Roman made his way to the basement, where his father's gun safe stood in the corner like a metal monument to preparedness. Inside were the tools of his trade: a Remington 700 sniper rifle, a modified AR-15, 2 Glock pistols, and various other implements acquired over 2 decades of service. But tonight, he reached for something simpler, a tactical knife his unit had given him after his second tour, engraved with the Special Forces motto, De Oppresso Liber, to liberate the oppressed. He'd spent years liberating strangers from tyranny. Now it was time to liberate himself from betrayal. Roman's phone rang again. This time, the caller ID showed Regina McKinney. "Where are you?" Her voice was sharp with false concern. "Luke's missing. We need to—" "I know." Roman's voice was flat, emotionless. "I'm coming home. Roman, He ended the call and turned off the phone. Whatever Regina McKinney had to say, she could save it for the reckoning that was coming. Chapter 2. The Unraveling. The drive from West Virginia to Millfield took Roman through winding mountain roads he'd traveled countless times as a boy. Each turn brought back memories. Summers spent hunting with his father, fishing trips with his grandfather, high school dates with Regina before the world got complicated. But tonight, the familiar landscape felt foreign. tainted by the knowledge of what waited at the end of the journey. Roman's mind worked like a tactical computer, processing information and formulating plans. He'd learned long ago that successful operations required intelligence, patience, and the will to see things through to their logical conclusion. Emotion was a luxury he couldn't afford, not when his son's safety hung in the balance. He pulled into the parking lot of Murphy's Diner, a 24-hour truck stop where he'd worked summers during high school. The neon sign flickered against the night sky, casting red and blue shadows across the pavement. Inside, he spotted a familiar figure hunched over a cup of coffee in a corner booth. Sheriff Saul Barr looked up as Roman approached. At 45, Saul had the weathered face of a man who'd seen too much small-town darkness. His uniform was rumpled, his badge reflecting the diner's fluorescent lights. "Roman." Saul stood and extended his hand. "Good to see you, though I wish it was under different circumstances." They sat across from each other, two middle-aged men bound by shared history and mutual respect. The waitress, a tired-looking woman in her 50s, brought Roman coffee without being asked. "Tell me everything," Roman said. Saul pulled out a small notebook, flipping through pages covered in his careful handwriting. "Hunter named Chester Durham, ironic considering, found Luke around midnight near Miller's Cave. Kid was hypothermic, scared out of his mind. Durham brought him to the hospital, where Dr. Cora Ortega treated him for exposure." Roman's hands tightened around his coffee cup. "Chester Durham? Regina's boyfriend." Saul's voice carried the weight of distaste. "Been seeing him for about 4 months, according to local gossip. He works part-time at the sawmill, part-time as a hunting guide. Real piece of work, 2 DUIs, history of domestic violence with his ex-wife." The irony wasn't lost on Roman. The man who'd found Luke was apparently the same man who'd helped abandon him. Either Chester Durham had a sudden attack of conscience, or something more complicated was at play. "What's Luke saying?" Saul's expression darkened. "Not much. He's traumatized, Roman. Keeps asking for you. Won't say a word about how he ended up out there. Dr. Ortega says he's physically fine, but psychologically." He shrugged. "Kid needs his father. Where is he now?" "Safe house. My sister Teresa runs a youth shelter 2 counties over. I figured it was better than leaving him with Regina, considering." Roman nodded, grateful for his old friend's foresight. "And Regina?" Playing the concerned mother for the cameras. Local news picked up the story. "Military father returns to search for missing son." She's got the whole town convinced you're some kind of absentee father who abandoned his family for the war. The familiar burn of injustice rose in Roman's chest. He'd given 16 years to his country, missing birthdays and holidays and school plays to serve something larger than himself. Now Regina was using his sacrifice as a weapon against him. "There's more," Saul continued. "I did some digging on Durham. He's not just some random drifter. Turns out he's Regina's cousin, second cousin, but still family. They've known each other since childhood." This information shifted everything. Roman had assumed Regina's affair was a recent development, born of loneliness and poor judgment. But if she had history with Durham, if this betrayal had deeper roots, met his friend's gaze steadily. "I'm not planning to disappear anyone, Saul. I'm planning to expose the truth." "And how exactly do you intend to do that?" Roman smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "The same way I've handled every mission for the past 20 years. Carefully." Chapter 3. Reconnaissance. The McKinney house sat on 5 acres of wooded land outside Millfield's town limits, a 2-story colonial that Roman had bought with his deployment bonuses and VA loan benefits. As he pulled into the gravel driveway, he could see Regina's car, a red Honda Civic he'd given her for their 10th anniversary, parked beside a black pickup truck he didn't recognize. Roman sat in his truck for a moment, studying the scene like a sniper calculating wind speed and distance. The house looked the same from the outside. White vinyl siding, green shutters, the tire swing he'd hung from the old oak tree for Luke's 8th birthday. But knowing what he knew now, it felt like enemy territory. He approached the front door with practiced silence, his military training allowing him to move without disturbing the dried leaves scattered across the porch. Through the living room window, he could hear voices, Regina soprano mixed with a deeper male tone he assumed belonged to Chester Durham. "Told you this would happen," Regina was saying, her voice tight with stress. "I told you he'd come back, and now look at the mess we're in." "Relax, Reggie." Durham's voice carried the lazy confidence of a man who'd never faced real consequences. "Your husband's been gone for months. What's he going to do, anyway? File for divorce? You'll get half of everything, plus alimony and child support." Roman pressed himself against the wall beside the window, using techniques he'd learned for urban reconnaissance. From this angle, he could see into the living room without being spotted. Regina McKinney stood by the fireplace, still beautiful at 38, but harder somehow, her blonde hair shorter than Roman remembered, and her clothes more expensive than their budget should have allowed. Chester Durham lounged on the couch Roman had bought last Christmas, a big man with prematurely gray hair and the soft look of someone who'd never pushed himself beyond comfort. "You don't understand," Regina said, pacing like a caged animal. "Roman's not like other men. He's intense, focused. When he sets his mind to something, he doesn't let go." Durham laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "What's he going to do? He's a soldier, not a detective. Besides, Luke can't prove anything. Kid was half frozen when I found him. Probably doesn't even remember how he got there." Roman's blood turned to ice. Durham had been the one to find Luke, but from the conversation, it sounded like he'd also been involved in abandoning him. The man was playing both sides, the concerned citizen who'd rescued the boy and the conspirator who'd helped endanger him in the first place. "That's not the point," Regina snapped. "The point is that Roman will start asking questions, and when he does, we stick to the story. Luke ran away because he was upset about his parents' marriage falling apart. You searched for him, called the police, played the worried mother. Durham found him during a hunting trip and brought him to safety. End of story." Regina shook her head. "You don't know him like I do. Roman's smart, Chester. Smarter than both of us put together. If he suspects something, then we'll deal with it." Durham stood and moved toward Regina, his hands settling on her shoulders in a gesture that was meant to be comforting but looked possessive to Roman's trained eye. "Look, we've come too far to back down now. The insurance policy alone will set us up for life." Insurance policy. Roman's mind raced, connecting dots he hadn't even known existed. Regina worked for Millfield Insurance, had worked there for 8 years, handling claims and policies for half the county. What kind of insurance policy were they talking about? "The accidental death benefit is $500,000, Regina said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "But only if it looks like an accident. If there's any suspicion, any investigation." Roman's world tilted on its axis. They weren't just talking about divorce or even abandoning Luke in the wilderness. They were planning to kill him, to make it look like an accident and collect on his life insurance policy. "The hunting trip is perfect," Durham continued. "Tragic accident in the mountains, experienced soldier caught off guard by the weather. It happens all the time. And Luke," Durham shrugged, "kid will be traumatized by losing his father so soon after getting lost. Natural that he'd want to stay with his mother instead of being shipped off to some relative he barely knows." Roman had heard enough. He backed away from the window with the same silent precision he'd used to approach, his mind already formulating a plan. Regina and Durham thought they were setting a trap for him, but they'd just revealed their hand to the one person capable of turning their scheme against them. As he reached his truck, Roman's phone buzzed with a text message. The number was local, but not in his contacts. "Your wife's planning something. Meet me at the old covered bridge tomorrow at noon. Come alone. A friend." Roman stared at the message for a long moment before deleting it. In his experience, anonymous tips were either traps or desperate cries for help. Either way, they required careful investigation. He started the engine and pulled out of the driveway, his headlights sweeping across the house where he'd once believed he had a future. That man, the one who'd trusted blindly and loved completely, was dead. What remained was a soldier with a mission: to protect his son and make his enemies pay for their betrayal. The war had finally come home. Chapter 4. The Network. Roman spent the night in a motel on the outskirts of Millfield, a rundown establishment that catered to truckers and travelers who valued anonymity over comfort. He'd checked in under the name John Frederick, one of several false identities he developed during his intelligence training, and paid cash for a week in advance. The room was spartiate but functional. A single bed, a small table, and a bathroom with fixtures that had seen better decades. Roman didn't need luxury. He needed a base of operations where he could plan without interference. He spread Luke's school photos across the table, studying his son's face for clues he might have missed. In the most recent picture, taken just before Roman's deployment 8 months ago, Luke's smile seemed forced, his eyes holding a wariness that hadn't been there before. How long had Regina been planning this? How long had his son been living in a house where his mother and her lover discussed murdering his father? At 0600 hours, Roman drove to the covered bridge mentioned in the mysterious text message. The structure dated to the 1890s, a wooden span that crossed Seneca Creek at its narrowest point. Local legend claimed it was haunted by the ghost of a Civil War soldier. Though Roman had never seen anything more supernatural than teenagers drinking beer and carving their initials into the weathered planks. He arrived early, positioning himself in the tree-line with a clear view of both approaches to the bridge. Military training had taught him that meetings with unknown parties required preparation and multiple exit strategies. At exactly noon, a figure emerged from the opposite end of the bridge. Roman recognized her immediately, Dr. Cora Ortega, the physician who'd treated Luke. She was a small woman in her early 40s, with dark hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to miss nothing. Roman had met her twice before, once when Luke broke his arm falling from a tree, and again during a routine physical before one of Roman's deployments. Roman emerged from the tree-line as Dr. Ortega reached the center of the bridge. She turned at the sound of his footsteps, her expression a mixture of relief and apprehension. "Thank you for coming," she said. "I wasn't sure you'd get my message." "Dr. Ortega," Roman nodded respectfully. "I assume this is about Luke." Among other things, she glanced around nervously, as if expecting to be overheard. "Roman, I need to tell you something about the night your son was brought to the hospital. Something that doesn't add up." Roman waited, his expression neutral. In his experience, people revealed more when they weren't prompted. Chester Durham brought Luke in around 12:30 a.m. Dr. Ortega continued. Claimed he found the boy near Miller's Cave during a late-night hunting trip. But here's the thing. Luke's injuries weren't consistent with someone who'd been lost in the wilderness for hours. Explain. The hypothermia was real but mild. His core temperature was only down to 94 degrees. Uncomfortable but not life-threatening. More importantly, he had marks on his wrists and ankles. Rope burns hidden under his clothes. Roman's jaw tightened. Someone tied him up. That's what I thought. But when I tried to ask Luke about it, he became agitated. Kept saying he couldn't remember, that everything was dark and cold. Then Regina arrived, and suddenly Luke wouldn't say anything at all. Dr. Ortega reached in her jacket and pulled out a manila envelope. I took pictures of the marks before Regina arrived. Officially, they're not in Luke's medical file. I documented them as minor abrasions consistent with outdoor exposure. But I kept copies because something felt wrong. Roman opened the envelope and examined the photographs. The rope burns were clear and distinctive, showing a pattern consistent with restraints rather than accidental contact. Someone had tied his son up and left him in the wilderness to die. "There's more," Dr. Ortega said. "I've been thinking about this for days, and I remembered something. About 6 months ago, Regina came to see me. Said she was having trouble sleeping, wanted a prescription for anxiety medication. During the consultation, she asked some unusual questions." "What kind of questions?" "Medical questions about hypothermia. How long it would take someone to die from exposure, what the symptoms would look like, whether there would be any obvious signs of foul play. I thought it was academic curiosity, morbid fascination with medical conditions. But now, Roman studied the doctor's face, reading the genuine concern in her eyes. Dr. Ortega was risking her career by sharing this information, motivated by nothing more than a desire to protect a child. It was exactly the kind of moral courage Roman had come to value during his years of service. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. "Because Luke is my patient, and his welfare is my responsibility. But also because..." She hesitated, then forged ahead. Because Regina tried to convince me to sign a death certificate without an autopsy. What? 2 days ago, she came to my office, supposedly to thank me for treating Luke. But during the conversation, she mentioned how difficult it would be if something happened to you, how traumatic an autopsy would be for the family, how much simpler it would be if a doctor who knew the family could just sign the certificate based on obvious circumstances. Roman felt the familiar coldness that preceded combat operations. Regina wasn't just planning his death. She was already preparing to cover it up. "Dr. Ortega, I need you to do something for me," he said. "I need you to keep those photographs safe, and I need you to document everything Regina said to you. If something happens to me, make sure Sheriff Barr gets that information. Roman, if you're in danger, why don't you just leave? Take Luke and start over somewhere else." Roman shook his head. "Because they'll follow us. And because running away doesn't solve the problem, it just delays it. Regina and Durham have crossed a line. They've involved my son in their scheme, and they're planning to murder me for money. That's not something I can forgive or forget." Dr. Ortega studied his face, perhaps recognizing something in his expression that reminded her why soldiers were trained differently from civilians. "What are you going to do?" "Well, I've always done," Roman replied. "Complete the mission." Chapter 5. The Hunter and the Hunted. Roman spent the afternoon conducting surveillance on Chester Durham, following him from the sawmill to Murphy's Diner to a ramshackle trailer park on the wrong side of Millfield. Durham lived in a double-wide mobile home that had seen better decades, surrounded by the detritus of a life lived without ambition or accountability. From his position in the tree lean, Roman observed Durham's routine with the patience of a sniper. The man drank beer on his sagging porch, made phone calls while pacing around his yard, and seemed generally agitated in the way of someone whose plans weren't proceeding smoothly. At 1800 hours, Durham's phone rang. Roman was too far away to hear the conversation, but he could read body language. Durham's posture straightened, his voice became animated, and he began gesturing as if arguing with the caller. When the call ended, Durham went inside and emerged 15 minutes later wearing hunting clothes and carrying a rifle case. Roman followed at a distance as Durham drove his black pickup into the mountains, using logging roads that wound deeper into the Monongahela National Forest. The terrain was familiar to Roman from childhood hunting trips with his father and grandfather. These mountains held 1,000 hiding places, 1,000 ways for a man to disappear forever. Durham's truck turned into a clearing Roman recognized, Miller's Hollow, a hunting camp used by local sportsmen during deer season. The camp consisted of a small cabin, an equipment shed, and a clearing large enough for vehicles and camping gear. More importantly, it was the closest road access to Miller's Cave, where Luke had supposedly been found. Roman parked his truck on a forestry road half a mile away and proceeded on foot, using game trails and natural cover to approach the camp unseen. His military training served him well in these mountains. The skills that had kept him alive in Afghan valleys translated perfectly to West Virginia wilderness. As he drew closer, Roman could see Durham setting up what appeared to be a hunting blind near the cabin. But this wasn't deer season, and Durham's positioning suggested he was expecting human prey rather than wildlife. Roman's phone vibrated with a text message. "Change of plans. Meet at Miller's Hollow at 2000 hours. Come alone. We need to talk. Regina." The pieces of the puzzle suddenly clicked into place. Regina was luring him to the exact spot where Durham was preparing an ambush. They'd planned this carefully, the concerned wife asking her estranged husband to meet for a reconciliation. The tragic hunting accident when a stray bullet found its target in the darkness. Roman smiled grimly. They'd made a fundamental error in assuming he would approach their trap with civilian caution rather than military precision. He circled the camp, noting sight lines and escape routes, identifying Durham's position and likely fields of fire. The hunting blind overlooked the clearing where vehicles would park, with additional cover behind the cabin and equipment shed. It was a competent ambush site for dealing with unsuspecting prey. Unfortunately for Durham, Roman McKinney was neither unsuspecting nor prey. Roman positioned himself on high ground overlooking the camp, settling into a sniper's hide he constructed from fallen logs and natural camouflage. From this position, he had clear sight lines to both the hunting blind and the access road. More importantly, he could observe without being observed. At 1930 hours, Regina's red Honda appeared on the logging road, headlights cutting through the growing darkness. She parked near the cabin and stepped out, wearing jeans and a heavy jacket that seemed inappropriate for a reconciliation meeting. Roman noted the bulge in her right jacket pocket, likely a pistol, though he couldn't be certain from this distance. Regina walked to the center of the clearing and checked her phone, presumably texting Roman to confirm he was coming. She seemed nervous, glancing frequently toward Durham's concealed position and the surrounding tree line. At exactly 2,000 hours, Roman sent his own text message. "I'm here, but not where you think." Regina's phone buzzed, and Roman watched her read the message through his rifle scope. Her reaction was immediate. Confusion followed by growing alarm as she realized their plan had been compromised. Durham emerged from his hiding place, rifle in hand, scanning the darkness with the desperate intensity of a man who just realized he was outmatched. "Where is he?" Durham called out, his voice carrying across the clearing. "I don't know," Regina replied, panic creeping into her voice. "He said he's here, but—" Roman's voice cut through the night air, amplified by a small megaphone he brought from his tactical gear. "I'm here, Regina. Right where you wanted me to be." Both conspirators spun toward the sound, but Roman had positioned himself to create an acoustic illusion. His voice seemed to come from multiple directions at once, a psychological warfare technique he'd learned during urban combat training. "Let's talk about Luke," Roman continued, his voice echoing off the surrounding hills. "Let's talk about how you tied up my son and left him to die in these mountains. Let's talk about the insurance policy you're planning to collect after your hunting accident goes wrong." Regina and Durham exchanged panicked glances, their carefully orchestrated plan crumbling in real time. "Let's talk about how this ends," Roman concluded, and the threat in his voice was unmistakable. Chapter 6. Confession in the Dark. "Roman, please." Regina's voice cracked as she called out to the darkness. "Let me explain. This isn't what you think." From his concealed position, Roman watched the two conspirators huddle together near Regina's car, their body language revealing the depth of their panic. Durham clutched his rifle with white knuckles, swinging it back and forth as he tried to locate a target in the shadows. Regina pressed close to her lover, one hand on his arm, as if seeking protection from the husband she'd betrayed. "Then explain it." Roman's voice echoed from the hills, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere. "Explain why my son had rope burns on his wrists. Explain why you asked Dr. Ortega about hypothermia 6 months ago. Explain the insurance policy." Durham's nerve broke first. "This is insane," he shouted, his voice high with stress. "We're leaving." He grabbed Regina's arm and started pulling her toward the car. Roman's next transmission stopped them cold. "Chester Durham. 2 DUIs, domestic violence conviction. Assault charges dropped when your ex-wife Tammy Crawford refused to testify. Currently unemployed, except for part-time work as a hunting guide and occasional shifts at Morrison Sawmill. Living in a trailer owned by your cousin Antonia Banks, behind on rent for 3 months. Durham released Regina's arm, his face pale in the moonlight. "How do you? I know a lot of things, Chester. I know you and Regina have been planning this for months. I know you convinced her that killing me was the only way to access my life insurance. I know you're both stupid enough to think you could get away with it." Regina stepped forward, her hands raised in a gesture of surrender. "Roman, stop this. We never meant for Luke to get hurt. That was an accident." "An accident?" Roman's voice carried the cold precision of a man rendering judgment. "You tied up a 14-year-old boy and left him in the wilderness overnight. You were willing to let him die to cover your tracks." "No." Regina's protest was desperate now. "We just needed him out of the way for one night. We were going to come back for him after you murdered me." Roman's statement hung in the air like a physical weight. Durham raised his rifle, scanning the tree line with desperate intensity. "Show yourself, you coward. Face me like a man." Roman's laughter was harsh and without humor. "A man? You want to talk about being a man, Chester? A man doesn't prey on children. A man doesn't seduce another man's wife while he's serving his country. A man doesn't plan murder for insurance money. We didn't have a choice. Regina cried out. You were never here, Roman. Always deployed, always putting the army first. I was lonely, and Chester was. Chester was using you, Roman interrupted. Just like he used his ex-wife before she finally got smart enough to leave him. Just like he's used every woman who was foolish enough to trust him. Durham's face twisted with rage. You don't know anything about us. Regina loves me. We're going to be together. Are you? Roman's voice carried a note of amusement. Tell me, Regina, has Chester mentioned his other girlfriend? The one in Beckley he visits every Thursday when he tells you he's working late at the sawmill. Regina turned to stare at Durham, confusion and hurt flickering across her face. What is he talking about? Durham's grip on his rifle wavered. He's lying, Reggie, trying to turn us against each other. Her name is Brooke Beck, Roman continued relentlessly. Bartender at the Mountaineer Tavern. 3 years younger than you. No children, no complications. He's been telling her the same lies he's been telling you. About leaving his current situation, starting over, building a life together. Chester. Regina's voice was small now, vulnerable in a way that made Roman remember the girl he'd fallen in love with 20 years ago. Durham spun toward her, his face desperate. Don't listen to him. He's trying to manipulate you. Like you manipulated her into betraying her husband and endangering her son. Roman's voice cut through Durham's protests. Like you manipulated her into thinking murder was the answer to her problems. Regina backed away from Durham, the full weight of her situation finally becoming clear. She betrayed everything that mattered for a man who'd been betraying her in return. I want to see Luke, she whispered. I want to see my son. Your son is safe, Roman replied. Safer than he's been in months. But whether you ever see him again depends on what happens in the next few minutes. Durham raised his rifle toward the sound of Roman's voice. Enough of this. Come out and face me, or I start shooting. Go ahead. Roman's voice was calm, almost conversational. Fire into the darkness at a target you can't see. Waste your ammunition on shadows and echoes. But remember, every shot you take tells me exactly where you are. The silence that followed was broken only by the wind in the trees and Durham's labored breathing. Roman could see the man's internal struggle, the desperate desire to fight warring with the growing realization that he was hopelessly outmatched. Here's what's going to happen, Roman continued. You're going to put down the rifle and walk to the center of the clearing. Both of you. And then you're going to tell me exactly how this was supposed to work. Every detail, every contingency, every lie you plan to tell. And if we don't, Durham's defiance was hollow now, the bravado of a man who'd run out of options. Roman's reply was quiet but carried the weight of absolute certainty. Then neither of you leaves these mountains alive. Chapter 7. The Reckoning. The confession came in pieces, extracted from Regina and Durham like shrapnel from a wound. They sat in the dirt of the clearing, hands visible, while Roman remained concealed in the darkness above them. His voice served as judge and prosecutor, patient and relentless in equal measure. Start from the beginning, Roman commanded. When did this start? Regina's voice was barely above a whisper. Last spring, after you left for your deployment. I was angry, tired of being alone all the time, tired of explaining to Luke why his father was never around for the important things. So you called your cousin. It wasn't like that. The protest was automatic but weak. Chester came to town for Grandma McKinney's funeral. We started talking, remembering old times. Durham shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. Roman could see the calculation in the man's eyes, wondering if cooperation might lead to mercy, not understanding that some betrayals put you beyond redemption. Tell him about the money, Roman said. The life insurance policy was always there, Regina continued. $500,000, double indemnity for accidental death. I never thought about it until Chester suggested it. Durham finally spoke up. She was drowning in debt, Roman. Credit cards, medical bills from when Luke broke his arm, mortgage payments she couldn't handle on her salary. The insurance was just sitting there. So you convinced her that murder was a better option than bankruptcy. It wasn't supposed to be murder. Regina's voice cracked. Chester said we could make it look like an accident. A hunting mishap, something that happened while you were out in the woods alone. No one would question it. Everyone knows soldiers sometimes have problems when they come back. Roman's voice turned deadly quiet. Problems. PTSD, Durham said, taking over the narrative. Veteran suicide rates, accidental shootings, risky behavior in the wilderness. We figure people would assume you'd either killed yourself or died because your military training made you overconfident in dangerous situations. And Luke. Regina's composure finally shattered completely. Luke was never supposed to be hurt. We just needed him out of the house that night, somewhere safe where he couldn't witness what happened or contradict our story. So you tied him up and left him in the wilderness. We were going to come back. Regina sobbed. After everything was over, Chester was going to find him during a search. Luke would have been cold and scared, but safe. He would have been the traumatized son who lost his father, deserving of sympathy and support. Roman processed this information with the clinical detachment of an intelligence analyst. The plan had a brutal efficiency to it. Eliminate the husband, traumatize the child into compliance, collect the insurance money, and disappear into a new life funded by blood and betrayal. What went wrong? Durham answered this time. Luke fought harder than we expected, got loose from the ropes somehow, and started making noise. We had to relocate him deeper in the cave system, tie him up again with better knots. By the time we finished, it was too late to implement the rest of the plan. So you decided to wait. We were going to try again the next night, Regina admitted. But then Luke got hypothermic faster than we anticipated. Chester panicked and brought him to the hospital before we could complete the operation. Roman felt a cold satisfaction at learning his enemy's weakness. They'd failed because they were amateurs, cruel enough to conceive a plan, but too incompetent to execute it properly. That incompetence had saved both Luke's life and his own. The anonymous tip, Roman said. Who sent it? Regina and Durham exchanged glances. What tip? Regina asked. Interesting. Someone else was involved in this situation, someone with enough awareness to warn Roman, but not enough courage to come forward directly. Roman filed that information away for later investigation. Here's what happens next, Roman announced. Chester, you're going to walk to your truck and drive away. You're going to keep driving until you're out of West Virginia, and you're never going to come back. Durham struggled to his feet, hope flickering in his eyes. And that's it? You let me go. I said you were going to drive away. I didn't say you were going to make it to the state line. The hope died instantly. Durham understood that Roman wasn't offering mercy. He was offering a head start in a hunt that would end only one way. Regina, you're going to get in your car and drive to the sheriff's office. You're going to confess everything, the affair, the insurance scheme, what you did to Luke. You're going to take full responsibility and cooperate completely with the investigation. Roman, please. The alternative is that I handle this my way without involving the legal system. And my way doesn't include trials or appeals or the possibility of parole. Regina nodded through her tears, understanding that she was being offered the only chance at survival she was likely to receive. One more thing, Roman added. If either of you ever contacts Luke again, if you ever come within 100 miles of him, if you ever speak his name to another living soul, I will find you. And when I do, what happens next will make tonight look like a friendly conversation. Durham was already backing toward his truck, his rifle forgotten in his haste to escape. Regina remained seated in the dirt, her face buried in her hands. Go, Roman commanded. Both of you. Now. As the two vehicles disappeared down the mountain road, Roman emerged from his concealment for the first time that night. The clearing seemed smaller somehow, diminished by the absence of the people who tried to turn it into his grave. He picked up Durham's abandoned rifle and ejected the chambered round, studying the cartridge in the moonlight. A .30-06 hunting round, perfectly legal, readily available, and capable of killing a man at considerable distance. It would have been the bullet that ended his life if he'd approached this meeting with trust instead of suspicion. Roman pocketed the cartridge as evidence and began the methodical process of clearing the scene. There would be no physical proof that tonight's confrontation had ever taken place. When the authorities found Chester Durham's truck wrapped around a tree on Highway 9, it would appear to be a single vehicle accident caused by excessive speed and alcohol consumption. When Regina McKinney confessed to attempted murder and child endangerment, there would be no corroborating evidence except her own words. The war was over, but the victory belonged to the soldier who'd learned long ago that the only unforgivable sin was leaving enemies alive to threaten what you loved. Chapter 8. Loose Ends. Roman found Chester Durham's black pickup truck 3 miles down Highway 9, wrapped around a massive oak tree with the kind of violence that suggested excessive speed and a complete loss of control. The impact had been so severe that the engine block had been driven into the cab, making survival impossible for anyone not wearing a seatbelt, which Durham hadn't been wearing, according to the evidence Roman had carefully arranged. The empty beer bottles scattered around the wreckage told their own story. A man drinking heavily while driving dangerous mountain roads, his judgment impaired by alcohol and desperation. The investigating officers would find Durham's blood alcohol level well above the legal limit, thanks to the whiskey Roman had forced down the unconscious man's throat before positioning him behind the wheel. It was a textbook single-vehicle fatality, the kind that happened with tragic regularity on West Virginia's winding mountain highways. No witnesses, no suspicious circumstances, no reason for anyone to question the obvious explanation. Roman stood in the tree line watching the emergency responders work, their flashing lights painting the crash scene in alternating red and blue. Sheriff Saul Barr moved through the wreckage with the methodical precision of a man who'd seen too many similar scenes, documenting everything for a report that would be filed and forgotten within a month. Roman's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Justice has been served. Thank you. A friend. This time, Roman didn't delete the message. Someone had been watching tonight's events unfold, someone with enough knowledge to understand what had really happened. Roman needed to identify this unknown ally before closing the final chapter of his revenge. He made his way back to his truck and drove to the Millfield County Sheriff's Office, arriving just as Regina's red Honda pulled into the parking lot. Through his windshield, he could see her sitting behind the wheel, gathering the courage to walk inside and confess to crimes that would destroy her life. Roman waited in the darkness, watching his wife of 16 years prepare to face the consequences of her betrayal. She looked smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of her guilt and the knowledge of what she'd lost. The woman who'd once been the center of his universe had become a stranger, someone capable of endangering their child for money and revenge. Regina finally emerged from her car and walked toward the sheriff's office entrance, her steps slow and reluctant. She paused at the door, turned to look back at the parking lot as if sensing Roman's presence, then disappeared inside the building. Roman didn't follow. He had no desire to witness Regina's confession or to see her taken into custody. That chapter of his life was over, closed as definitively as Chester Durham's had been on Highway 9. Instead, he drove to the youth shelter where Luke was staying, a converted Victorian house that served as a temporary refuge for children in crisis. The facility was run by Teresa Stevenson, Sheriff Barr's sister, a former social worker who dedicated her life to protecting kids from the failures of the adults who were supposed to love them. Roman parked outside and sat for a moment, preparing himself for the most important conversation of his life. Luke had been through trauma that no child should endure. Abandoned by his mother, used as a pawn in a murder plot, forced to confront the reality that the people he trusted most had been willing to sacrifice him for money. The front porch light came on as Roman approached the house, and Teresa appeared in the doorway. She was a woman in her early 50s with graying hair and kind eyes that had seen too much suffering but hadn't lost their compassion. "Roman," she said softly, "Luke's been waiting for you. How is he? Physically? He's fine. Emotionally?" She shrugged. "He's a strong kid, but what he's been through would break most adults. He knows something terrible almost happened, even if he doesn't understand all the details." Teresa led Roman through the house to a small sitting room where Luke sat reading a paperback novel. The boy looked up as his father entered, and Roman felt his heart break at the mixture of relief and wariness in his son's eyes. "Dad." Luke's voice was carefully neutral, the tone of someone who'd learned not to trust completely. "Hey, buddy." Roman sat in the chair across from his son, studying the face that was so much like his own at that age. "How are you feeling?" Confused, Luke admitted. "Mom said you were coming home to take me away from her. Said you blamed her for what happened to me in the mountains. But Sheriff Barr says she's the one who hurt me." Roman chose his words carefully. "Your mother made some very bad choices, Luke. Choices that put you in danger and nearly destroyed our family. But that doesn't mean she doesn't love you. Then why did she do it?" It was the question Roman had been dreading, because the honest answer was too complex and too painful for a 14-year-old to fully understand. How could he explain that love sometimes turned into something twisted and selfish? How could he help his son comprehend that the woman who'd given birth to him had been willing to sacrifice him for money? "People sometimes do terrible things when they're scared or desperate," Roman said finally. "Your mother thought she was trapped in a situation she couldn't escape from, and she made choices that seemed logical to her at the time. That doesn't excuse what she did, but it might help explain it." Luke nodded slowly, processing this information with the careful consideration of someone who'd been forced to grow up too quickly. "What happens now?" the boy asked. "Now we start over," Roman replied. "Just you and me, somewhere far from here. I'm retiring from the army, and we're going to find a place where we can build a new life together." "What about Mom?" Roman met his son's eyes directly. "Your mother's going to prison, Luke. For a very long time. What she did to you, what she planned to do to me, those are serious crimes with serious consequences." Luke was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. When he looked up again, there were tears in his eyes, but also something that looked like relief. "I'm glad you're okay, Dad. When they left me in that cave, I thought I'd never see you again." Roman moved to the couch and pulled his son into a fierce embrace, feeling the boy's tears soak into his shirt. They sat that way for a long time, father and son mourning the family they'd lost while finding strength in what remained. "I love you, Luke," Roman whispered. "And I promise you, nothing like this will ever happen again. I'll never let anyone hurt you again." "I know," Luke replied, and Roman heard the absolute trust in his son's voice. It was a trust he'd earned through years of keeping his promises, and one he intended to honor for the rest of his life. Outside, the autumn wind carried the sound of sirens as emergency responders finished cleaning up Chester Durham's final mistake. But inside the shelter, a father and son began the long process of healing from betrayal and building something new from the ashes of what they'd lost. Chapter 9, New Beginnings. 6 months later, Roman McKinney stood on the deck of a cabin overlooking Lake Tahoe, watching his son cast a fishing line into the clear mountain water. The California sun was warm on his face, a welcome change from the cold mountains of West Virginia and the memories they held. Luke had grown 3 inches since they'd left Millfield, filling out with the rapid development of adolescence. More importantly, the wariness had faded from his eyes, replaced by the natural confidence of a boy who knew his father would protect him from anything. Roman's phone buzzed with a text message from Sheriff Saul Barr. Regina pleaded guilty to attempted murder and child endangerment. 25 years minimum. Thought you should know. Roman deleted the message without replying. Regina McKinney was part of a past he'd left behind, a cautionary tale about the price of betrayal and the consequences of choosing weakness over loyalty. "Dad," Luke called from the dock. "I think I've got something." Roman walked down to help his son reel in what turned out to be a respectable rainbow trout, the fish fighting hard before surrendering to superior strategy and patience. They released it back into the lake, watching it disappear into the depths with a flash of silver scales. "Think we should head back?" Luke asked, checking his watch. "Dr. Martinez said she wanted to see you at 3. Dr. Elena Martinez was Luke's therapist, a skilled professional who'd helped the boy process the trauma of his mother's betrayal without losing his capacity for trust. The sessions had been difficult at first. Luke had been reluctant to discuss what had happened, afraid that talking about it would somehow make it real again. But Dr. Martinez had patience and skill, and gradually Luke had begun to open up about his experiences. Roman attended every session, learning how to recognize the signs of anxiety and depression, how to provide support without being overprotective, how to help his son heal without rushing the process. Actually, Roman said, Dr. Martinez wanted to see both of us today. She says you're making excellent progress. They walked back to the cabin, a modest 3-bedroom structure Roman had purchased with cash from his military savings and retirement benefits. It was isolated enough to provide privacy, but close enough to town that Luke could attend the local high school and participate in normal teenage activities. Roman had enrolled Luke in martial arts classes and wilderness survival courses, teaching him skills that would build confidence and self-reliance. The boy showed natural aptitude for both, approaching each challenge with a methodical determination he'd inherited from his father. At Dr. Martinez's office, Luke settled into his usual chair while Roman took the seat beside him. The therapist was a woman in her 40s with warm eyes and an easy manner that put even reluctant patients at ease. Luke's been telling me about the fishing trip you're planning, Dr. Martinez began. Alaska, isn't it? 2 weeks on the Kenai Peninsula, Roman confirmed. Fishing, hiking, camping under the stars. Luke's been researching the area for months. It sounds wonderful. Luke, how do you feel about spending that much time in the wilderness? Luke considered the question seriously. Excited, he said finally, I know Dad won't let anything happen to me, and I want to prove to myself that I'm not afraid of being outside anymore. Dr. Martinez nodded approvingly. That's a very mature attitude. Roman, do you have any concerns about the trip? Only that Luke might catch a bigger salmon than I do, Roman replied, earning a laugh from his son. After the session, they drove into town for supplies, stopping at the hardware store for camping gear and the bookstore for maps and field guides. Lake Tahoe was a tourist destination, but it was also a working community where newcomers could blend in without attracting unwanted attention. Roman had established a new identity for both of them, legitimate documents obtained through contacts in military intelligence, complete with background histories that would survive casual investigation. To their neighbors, they were Marcus and David Wells, a retired veteran and his son starting over after a family tragedy. At the grocery store, they encountered Patty McGowan, a local teacher who'd befriended Luke during his first weeks at the new school. She was a woman in her 30s with red hair and freckles, divorced with no children of her own, but a natural affinity for young people. Luke, she called out, approaching with a cart full of school supplies. Are you ready for the science fair next month? Working on it, Luke replied with a grin. Dad's helping me build a weather monitoring station with remote sensors. That sounds ambitious. Will you be entering the regional competition if you win locally? Roman watched the interaction with quiet satisfaction. Luke was building new relationships, forming connections that had nothing to do with the trauma he'd experienced. The boy was healing, growing stronger, becoming the person he was meant to be before betrayal and violence had tried to break him. That evening, they sat on the deck watching the sunset paint the lake in shades of gold and crimson. Luke was reading a novel, science fiction this time, about exploration and discovery in distant galaxies. Roman worked on cleaning his fishing equipment, the routine maintenance that kept gear reliable and functional. Dad, Luke's voice was thoughtful. Do you think about her? About Mom? Roman set down the reel he'd been cleaning and considered the question. Sometimes, he admitted, I think about the woman I married, the person she was before everything went wrong. But that person doesn't exist anymore, Luke. People change, and sometimes they change into someone you can't recognize or forgive. Do you hate her? No, Roman said truthfully. Hate requires energy I'd rather spend on more important things, like making sure you grow up to be a good man who makes good choices. Luke nodded, processing this information with the careful consideration that had become his habit when discussing difficult topics. I don't want to see her again, he said quietly. Even when I'm older, even if she gets out of prison. Is that wrong? Roman moved to sit beside his son, putting an arm around the boy's shoulders. That's not wrong, Luke. That's self-preservation. You don't owe forgiveness to someone who hurt you, no matter what relationship you used to have with them. Some betrayals are unforgivable, and some bridges can't be rebuilt once they're burned. They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell over the lake, father and son united by shared experience and mutual loyalty. In the distance, a loon called across the water, its voice echoing off the surrounding mountains like a promise of wilderness and freedom. Roman McKinney had completed his final mission. He'd protected his son, eliminated his enemies, and built a new life from the ashes of betrayal. The soldier was finally at peace, his duty done, and his honor intact. Some men fought for country, others for ideology or glory. Roman had fought for something simpler and more important: the right of a father to protect his child and the obligation to make betrayers pay for their crimes. In the end, that was enough. That was everything. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen, and I'll see you there.